Alright, so we're going to pick up now with the Second Punic War, and what takes place, in this case, all over the Mediterranean, from Spain to Italy to North Africa. And one of the things you should keep in mind as we're looking at this is why the Carthaginians and the Romans are at war. Some background on the Second Punic War has to do with Hannibal, who you've already watched the movie on, Hannibal and his family, the Barcas, in Spain. They had in the aftermath of the First Punic War, the Barca family had made a lot of inroads into Spain, had made a lot of allies, had created alliances with a number of cities. They had taken over others in sort of central and southern, particularly coastal Spain, and this gave them a lot of resources and a lot of power that was actually, people in Carthage, their sort of rivals in Carthage, were worried about this, at least to some degree. But the context then is that Spain becomes the sort of focal point, at least at the beginning of the war, and issues regarding the cities there. A lot of the cities that are in Spain, particularly on the coast, are Greek cities. They are former Greek colonies that had branched out decades, if not centuries in some cases, before. And some of those, particularly in the north, ended up having treaties with the Romans over the years. And so as Carthage sort of grew in power, and Rome as well, into areas of Spain, the two of them end up having a series of allies among a variety of these cities. It's important to note, too, that in the aftermath of the First Punic War, that the Romans and the Carthaginians actually had a treaty, which is called the Ebro River Treaty. And the Ebro River is a river in sort of northern Spain that was used as a dividing line between Carthaginian territory to the south and Roman territory, or at least Roman areas of influence to the north. And this is important because the treaty basically stipulated that neither of the two sides would infringe upon the other's sphere of influence. So the Carthaginians would not go north of the Ebro River, and the Romans would not go south of the Ebro River, and so it kind of created sort of a neutral area in which they were not supposed to cross. And keep that in mind, because of course by mentioning it, it means that actually both sides end up crossing it and leading to war. Now, in order to understand a little bit more about why Hannibal gets involved with this, part of that has to do with what you've heard about from the video, but also what you read about in terms of Hannibal's oath. Remember that apparently, according to myth, which is a Roman myth, that as a young child, Hannibal's father, Hamilcar, had taken Hannibal to an altar, offered a sacrifice, and then made Hannibal swear an undying oath, an oath of undying revenge against Rome, that he would avenge Carthage's loss in the First Punic War. This is unlikely to have happened for a number of reasons. The Romans wanted to sort of make Hannibal larger than life, although they didn't really need to, considering his achievements against them. But that's another aspect to the sort of Roman mythology around Hannibal. It's likely that he could have actually had this oath as a child, but it also gives it sort of a deeper meaning. The important aspect here is the issue of the city of Saguntum. In 219, this city is south of the Ebro River. That puts it well within Carthaginian territory. And we're not talking about just a few miles. It's south of the river by a ways. So this is in Carthaginian territory. The issue comes up is because as Hannibal and his own almost sort of private armies are taking over, the Barcas are taking over these territories in Spain, they end up coming into contact with Saguntum and are trying to force Saguntum to join them. And in the immediate aftermath of that, the inhabitants of Saguntum send envoys to Rome and ask for Roman help. So the Romans are kind of in a bind here because they have that treaty, and yet they have someone asking for an alliance, for another treaty with them. So the Romans decide that they would like to help Saguntum, but they decide to approach the Carthaginians themselves. And so they go to Carthage and they petition they decide to go the route of diplomacy. So they go to the Carthaginian Senate and lay their case before them, saying, here is the city of Saguntum, they have asked us for help, and we would like to. And the Carthaginian Senate is really sort of delaying most of the time that the Romans are there. And in fact, what happens is that it appears that the Carthaginians were fully aware of what Hannibal was doing to the city of Saguntum, and while the Senate was sort of hemming and hawing and waiting and biding their time, Hannibal was in the process of sacking the city. So the Romans have sent down the negotiator Quintus Fabius Maximus, and when he is negotiating with the Carthaginians, he asks them to get Hannibal to stop his siege of Saguntum, and actually to send Hannibal to them to sort of put on trial for the Roman version of war crimes because of the things that he's been doing in the city of Saguntum. While he is there, and the Carthaginians are sort of, again, delaying, he receives word that the city of Saguntum has fallen to Hannibal. And he is outraged. He's outraged and believes that this entire time that the Carthaginians have known this, and this has just been all part of a plot to take over Saguntum, to embarrass the Romans, and he finds this despicable. And for the Romans then, first for Maximus and then later for the rest of the Romans, this becomes an example of that term you see there, fides punica. Remember that term fides before, from fidelity, and punica is from the term Phoenician for the Carthaginians. So this means Punic faith or Carthaginian faith, but it's an oxymoron for the Romans, that they are actually unfaithful to ideals like fides. And in fact, they've been lying this whole time. So this idea that the Carthaginians are deceptive and that they are sneaky is all kind of bound up in fides punica, that you can't trust the Carthaginians. The long and the short of the story of Maximus is that with this sort of attitude by the Carthaginians, Maximus takes his toga, and you can see him in this much later picture, obviously, stylized picture, where he takes his toga and he rolls it up into two folds and approaches the Carthaginian Senate and says, look, in one hand I hold war, and in the other hand I hold peace. So he's rolled it up into two different parts, and he says, you need to decide what it's going to be between us and Carthage. And the Carthaginian Senate laughs at him and says, well, why don't you decide? So he throws down the hand that has the fold of war in it and declares war on Carthage and takes that message back to Rome. And then basically the war is on from that point, beginning roughly in 218. Although the quality of this map is not great, you can see that Saguntum is in the center of, I'll actually try to move the cursor up here. Here's the city of Saguntum. Here is the Ebro River, so it's much further north. It's not just simply that the city of Saguntum lies here or here. And a lot of the cities up through here, Emporium, Antarico, and others have had alliances with Rome. But you can see Saguntum is very much to the south of the Ebro River. Now, what happens then is that while the Romans decide that they want to invade Spain and attack Hannibal at Saguntum, Hannibal has decided, in fact, that he wants to invade Rome. And you've got a lot of this from the Hannibal documentary that you watched. So the next little bit I'm going to move over fairly quickly and just give you a couple pointers. Basically what happens is, as the Roman armies descend on Spain, Hannibal's gone. He does leave his brother there to fight off the Romans, but basically Hannibal begins his march up through southern France, crossing the Rhone, and then heading over the Alps in a daring sort of raid on Italian and Roman territory. So, a couple points about the Second Punic War then. The timeline of this war, Hannibal's march begins in 218, and this becomes a sort of mythologized march. And you can kind of see that in the picture down below. It's Hannibal and his tens of thousands of troops and war elephants. Some of the estimates are that he had approximately 40,000 troops, and about 30,000 of those were infantry, and about 9 to 10,000 were cavalry, and he left with something like 37 war elephants. The war elephants seem important, but by the end they're really not, because only one of them, at least according to most sources, only one of them survives to make it into Roman territory. But he does do a daring crossing of the Alps during wintertime, and the Romans don't expect this, but he also suffers heavy losses. He loses approximately 10,000 infantry. These men are dying of exposure and starvation, cold. And he loses about 6,000 of his 9,000 strong cavalry. So he only has about 3,000 cavalry left. But even still, he's able to make it into Roman territory. Two large armies of the Romans have left to try to engage him in Spain, but he's no longer there. So what's going to happen then, as you can see from this map here, is that Hannibal, here is Hannibal's route. Hopefully, again, the cursor shows up. Here's Saguntum. Hannibal's route takes him along the coast. takes him up here over the Rhone, and then he will end up fighting the Romans at Ticinus, at Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, later at Cannae. These are going to be all terrible defeats for the Romans. Meanwhile, the Publius and Gnaeus Scipio have set sail from Roman territory here, and they move across the Mediterranean, stopping in Scylla, working their way down, where they're eventually going to try to engage Hasdrubal, his brother. So the remainder of what happens to Hannibal's army is actually a surprising number of victories against the Romans. In 218, at the Battle of Trebia, the Romans engage Hannibal and are completely annihilated. About 30,000 Romans die at the Battle of Trebia. The next year, at the Battle of Lake Trasimene, Hannibal basically rushes over sort of a hillside. He draws out the consuls into a battle that they were not ready for, and slaughters between 30 and 40,000 Romans, and then takes several thousand prisoners. It's important to note that the consul is also killed during this as well, so Rome is pretty much in a state of emergency. In just about a year's time, Rome is looking at between 60 and 70,000 dead just from these two battles, not to mention the first one at Ticinus earlier. So this is not good for Rome. So what happens is that the Romans decide to elect Quintius Fabius Maximus as dictator, which we haven't actually seen for quite some time. Remember, Fabius Maximus was the one who had tried the diplomatic route in Rome. And in 217 he is appointed dictator, and he is given the name or sort of title as Cunctator, and this means delayer. Basically, his strategy was not to engage Hannibal directly, but instead to harass his supply lines, to engage him in small skirmishes, and essentially fight guerrilla warfare against him, because taking his army out into the open would just allow Hannibal's army to slaughter the Romans, and that wasn't going to work at all for him. And this strategy was successful for the remainder of his time as dictator. He was only in for approximately a year. It was renewed, and he was very successful in harassing Hannibal and wearing down his troops, but a lot of the Romans felt that this was an affront to their Roman identity and their masculinity and their military worthiness, and so they decided that instead they needed to attack Hannibal straight on. So as soon as Maximus was done as leader, the Romans decided to attack, and it turned out terribly for them. So here's a couple of the things that happened with them. The worst Roman defeat during this period was the Battle of Cannae in 216, when Hannibal destroys two consular armies and results in roughly 65,000 Romans dead. So you have to think we are, about 150,000 Romans have died in just a few short years. And it looks like Maximus's idea of being the delayer was a smart one, because now they're all dead. As you've also read, you know that there's a number of allied defections. Cities like Capua, Tarentum, and even Syracuse in Sicily, all of these defect. Many of these are former Greek cities, but all of these defect and aid essentially Hannibal over the course of the next few years. But fortunately for Rome, Hannibal never ends up actually attacking it, and you saw this in the video. Hannibal never attacks Rome directly, which after Cannae he could have, but he didn't. And instead, Rome uses this time, as Hannibal goes far into the south, Rome uses this time to recover. They begin conscripting as many people as possible and relying upon their allies who are still loyal to them. And so by 212, with just a few years, Rome is able to put 25 legions into the field. Bear in mind that a legion, in many of these cases, has roughly 5,500 men to them. So Rome is putting tens of thousands of men back into the field. And in the case of Rome, they're able to use this to their advantage, harass Hannibal again, although the war is going to drag on for almost another decade. And bear in mind, too, that Rome also fights in other places. They fight in Macedonia, which I'll mention in a minute, in 215, and they're also fighting in Syracuse as well. So they're not just fighting in Italy. They're also fighting in Spain, although not always successfully. And so that's something to bear in mind, that the Romans have spread out this far during this time. And we'll pick this up in part 3 in just a moment.